All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second episode of The View from 6 Feet Under. So, for anybody who got to watch our last episode, you may recognize that my usual co host, AG, is not here. AG had another AG had another thing that they needed to do tonight, prior engagement. So I have brought in one of my very good friends, the goth father himself, uh, Dorian. Dorian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, yeah, I was kind of the pinch hitter for this episode. Um, let's see, a little bit about myself. I live in an apartment that's like a haunted Applebee's, um,
it's like
and
the
I hope
it's like the gentlest abattoir I've ever seen.
it's just kitschy and weird and spooky, and I'm hoping that my next home comes pre-haunted because those are really hard to find these days.
You realize from now on I'm calling your house Goth Applebee's. I'm calling it Gothlebee's.
Oh God, please. That is like
And
the
you
only
can't
thing I
stop
want in
me.
this life.
But yeah, please go on. So for anybody who doesn't know, the theme of today's episode is going to be fear and folklore. And we're going to kind of be covering old folklore that would one day go on to inspire our horror films, our comics, our novels, all of our horror media, our haunted houses. And we're going to kind of get into where some of these folklore pieces came from, why they developed, and why maybe they still persevere with us today. So, Dorian, if you'd like to speak to kind of your experience in that realm, that would be great.
I am actually an avid collector. Well, I wish I was more of an avid collector of folklore, but especially fairy tales. I love fairy tale collections. Some of my most prized possessions are older books that are just compiling all of those old stories together. It's really weird, some of the stories that you consider like children's stories, and then you read them and you're like, oh, that's kind of messed up.
Well, I think, and you've actually given us a great jumping off point to go ahead and dive into the meat of today's episode. Oof, dive into meat. That was a really tragic way to phrase that. Um, but I feel like that's actually a really great jumping off point because one of the big things that a lot of horror scholars discuss is there is a definite point where the reason for horror went from moral teaching and moral instruction to entertainment. And so a lot of what these same scholars would consider early horror would be these things like fairy tales and folk tales. And they were things that required a sense of moral instruction. And so let's begin in the very good place. If we're talking about fairy tales, let's begin with the fair folk, the fairies, who were not exactly your blue fairy from Cinderella. The fairies that we're going to be dealing with today are, by and large, far, far worse creatures than Disney ever conceived of.
I think it's fascinating to compare those old stories and just see how ruthless and strange and malicious the old fairies were in folklore and compare them to like here's the cool fairy stickers that we put on things and our blue fairies and
Oh, and
Pinocchio
here's
and things like that. I mean,
Tinkerbell.
these were
Oh,
yeah, here's Tinkerbell.
oh, you're right. The blue fairy was Pinocchio. Pull some fairy tale cards away from my pack. Wow, that was a slip. Um, actually, funnily enough, it's so wild to me how real the fear of the fairies was for people. My cousin, I believe it was either his great uncle or his great grandfather, his actual cause of death legally was the fairies. he went mad and ran off of a cliff.
I love that there are still places out there like especially in Ireland, but in Scotland as well, where they just do not mess with the fair folk. Because like even the people who don't 100% believe it, it's just, you don't go over there. You don't, because you never know. And I think that's kind of one of the key things about the fair folk is they exist in a place that's not our world, but it's also linked to our world. And there is that fear of what else is out there, especially whenever we're looking at, human history. Before we had maps documenting every single thing, it's, don't go too far or the fair folk will get you.
Or here there be monsters or any number of other things.
And yeah, and I love how it ties into, be careful who you're dealing with. If you make a deal with somebody, is this a person? Is it not just a trustworthy person, but is it a person to begin with? And also changeling folklore, I think from that standpoint is also fascinating. The It's also kind of tragic to think about it. Back in the day, here is a child who these days we would, see as maybe having some emotional issues, could use some counseling and things like that, or um, someone who grew up into a person who I personally like. If I'm a parent, this is a child who their way of expressing themselves doesn't line up with what I think is morally right and correct. Well, that's clearly a fairy who replaced my true child and stole my true child away from me. Which I love changeling lore from a standpoint of just these were kind of the ways that we explain things back then whenever we didn't have the words for them, and didn't have a real way to break down, what was going on with this child. It was just this sense that this child is alien to me.
And what's really very frightening is there were actual murder cases where people were so afraid that their wife had been changed in the night, taken by the fairies, that in an attempt to drive the changeling out, they would actually murder their spouses. There was a very infamous murder case, which I believe is actually covered by Aaron Mankey in his lore series quite well. But it took such a hold of our imagination and our realities that there were actual murder cases from this. And what's really fascinating about fairy lore is it actually began to affect how we built our cities. Because, and this is a theme I'm going to be discussing a lot tonight, a lot of our early folklore was moral instruction and societal instruction based around the fear of the other. That was the thing that was out there that we didn't understand. And so one of the most remarkable examples that I recall was I spent a summer in Edinburgh. And while I was there, I got the chance to go to Greyfriars Kirkyard. And while you are in the kirkyard, there is a piece of the old Flodden wall still there. And a lot of the folklore surrounding the Flodden wall is that it entirely ringed the city, and the city did not expand out. The city began to build up on top of itself, which of course was how we had things like the fire in Edinburgh, and how we had the entire subterranean network in Edinburgh, which, by the way, is actually the only place I've ever been in my life where I felt truly frightened, and that's saying a lot. The underground city of Edinburgh is terrifying. Even if you don't believe in ghosts and ghoulies and monsters, there is deep psychological suffering, especially when you understand the lives of the people who lived there under the bridges in the Undercity. But part of the reason we didn't build out was that was that belonged to the fairies. That belonged to the others. We don't know what's out there. And you find this in early infrastructure. We're so desperate not to be exposed to what's out there that we built on top of ourselves. And now this what's out there could be anything. And in a realistic sense, it would be invaders, it would be armies, it could be plague, but obviously for that sense of moral instruction, our imagination meshed with reality and created fairies who could spread plague. Um, Created fairies who could carry you off, who could look exactly like your loved ones. So the Fae, actually, it's very interesting, have a very, and had a very tight grip on kind of our collective social consciousness for a very extended period of time. And I think they still might in a way.
I think they do too, especially as we're looking more recently at the rise of modern neo-paganism. The Fae are very popular with those crowds, especially as creatures who are not necessarily benevolent. They're not sparkly. They're not very sweet. In an effort to kind of connect to some of those old traditions, but also because I think, and especially this ties back to why these characters, these type of characters like the changeling, the cursed child, and things like that show up in horror because they still fascinate us.
And as a matter of fact, I know on the previous episode, I referenced the Magnus archives, but I'm going to do it again because while I think necessarily fairies themselves are not still pervasive in our horror media, um, I feel like a lot of the concepts that came with fairy folklore are things that still concern us on a deep psychological level. So things like, is this person who I think they are? Is my world the same I remember it being? And a lot of what made fairy folklore very frightening was a lot of the things that you did were completely arbitrary. You could step on the wrong piece of grass. And I think a lot of fairy folklore could also be an expression of our fear of entropy, which especially has been embraced very frequently by more modern horror films where you don't have to do anything.
Yeah, and I think that one of the reasons why we don't see fairies as much is just in pop culture. With Pinocchio, Tinkerbell, things like that. Since I wouldn't really say the late Victorian era, whenever we started getting photographs, and we had those
There
very
were the very
popular, yeah,
famous ones, yes.
yeah. They became something that was sort of for children, which previously they weren't. But we have a sense these days from all of this pop culture reference and things like that that these are little people with wings, but in reality the fae folk were so much more than that. They were people, they were creatures, they were spirits that
They were
were,
an extension of a greater universe that didn't necessarily care about your well-being.
yeah, in a lot of senses, like the easiest way that I can think of them is very similar to the how the Japanese approach kami and other spirits. This is part of the world that they live in, especially these islands that they're tied to. This is something that exists there, but it's not necessarily one thing.
Yes. Well, one theme that I think we're going to find as we move on through different pieces of folklore, well, let me qualify, Western folklore, is the Industrial Revolution changed a whole lot about what scares us. So I think we're going to find a lot of the things I want to cover today, things like fae, werewolves, vampires, witches, the old, and this is, of course, a racist term, and I don't relish using it, but like the old gypsy witch. Um, a lot of these things that were a very real part of our system of belief and our system of fear, you'll notice around the Industrial Revolution, they became less pervasive as actual horror, because we were beginning to see the rise of real human horror. I mean, we had Upton Sinclair writing, we had Jack the Ripper on the rise at the turn of the century. We were beginning to see depths of human misery that didn't necessarily stem from anything else, and we were learning that we were kind of the monsters. So I think we will begin, like, as we go through our discussion, I think we will see a lot of these things shift around the Industrial Revolution as far as subjects of our folklore and subjects of horror. And they became playhouse monsters. Like, we began to see a lot of macabre theater in France and England, and it was during this Industrial Revolution era where these things became shadow puppets instead of the monsters that kept us, that influenced our entire infrastructure for
Well,
years.
we also around that time started, we had telegraphs and things like that. So
The
whenever
daguerreotype.
something, yeah, whenever something happened inside your city or your town, it was no longer confined to this local tragedy. This was, we were hearing news from other cities about horrible things that were happening. And that kind of became more pervasive and a bigger part of horror around the turn of the century than, these old fairy tales and old folklore and mythology. But that was also very trendy at the time,
Mhm.
to really trust in what was considered at the time modern science to explain all of these things.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to go ahead and get that out there, because I think a lot of our conversation is going to be like, yeah, and werewolves were a very, very interesting, like, thing we were actually afraid of. But then this happened. And I feel like one of the main countries, or one of the regions of the world where we don't necessarily see that, is going to be Asia. And I'm going to focus specifically on Japan because that's where I grew up and that's where I lived. So I have more of a real concept of the myth and folklore there. But let's go ahead and move on to another big one. And again, that fear of the other is a huge one here. And I think we're also going to have to cover that fundamental misunderstanding of mental illness and social illness. And let's get on to werewolves. So, werewolves are fascinating to me. So, werewolves, as of 2014, with our current understanding, the only thing that we still really think about werewolves is we have clinical lycanthropy, which is a very rare psychiatric syndrome, where sufferers have the delusional belief that they are werewolves. They grunt, they claw, they have this perception that they're covered in hair, and they believe that they are metamorphizing into a wolf. But this is the only real modern concept of it that Westerners have. And I actually find that a little bit mental. Um, so the werewolf mythology, actually, scholars are a little bit torn. Some believe that one of the first recorded iterations of the werewolf was in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but we also have it surfacing in Greece with Grecian mythology with the story of Lycaon, where Lycaon angered Zeus when he served him a meal made out of the remains of a sacrificed child, and Zeus turned him into a wolf man. Um, and we were terrified of werewolves because the same thing with the Fae, or with stories of the fairies. What do I
These
not know
were
about this person?
Yeah, this is somebody that you think who's capable of completely inhuman acts. But during the day, this might be someone who lives on the next farm over, who's very polite, very kind to you, but you don't know what happens over there at night. Um,
Yeah. And a
there's
lot of,
there's definitely that. Yeah. I
yeah.
also I think we also have a couple of like nice werewolves, quote unquote, but that's more in um I believe it's Welsh or Scottish tradition. There are one or two occurrences of those, but by and large, these are, this might be your neighbor who's perfectly normal. Um,
And I feel like a lot of that came from the way our society was, where things that were different threatened us. We didn't understand them, and they could do us very real harm. And leave us not forget, I sort of hesitate to bring this up alongside werewolves, but it was technically a case that was never satisfactorily solved, and that is the Beast of Javadon. So the Beast of Javadon, which of course is from the Javadon region in France, is technically considered a cryptid, but nobody can decide if it was a rogue wolf, if it was a rogue hyena that had gotten loose from a royal zoo, even though there's no notation on manifests that one of those animals had been imported, et cetera, et cetera. Essentially, the small town of Javadon was for about 2 years um, beset upon by a strange wolf-like creature. Um, there were very few noted survivors. As a matter of fact, one of the only noted survivors has a statue dedicated to her in town, and it's quite striking, where she's standing with her spear right up through the beast's chest. Um, but with so few survivors, nobody. It was building on that fear of the unknown, because these people were just gone, violently and suddenly gone. And all we knew was it was a wolf-like creature that was doing it. And this invaded this region's world for 2 years. So I also feel like one of our big fears about werewolves could be the fear of the bestial, of the things that do not adhere to societal norms in any way that resembles humanity.
and I think to go back to the previous, this is a monster that is human during the day, especially if we're looking at the 1700s, looking in colonial America and other places. You really have to band together to survive. So
Hmm.
one of the most frightening things is that someone in your community who you are absolutely relying on is a terrible monster.
And then in that case, when you are relying on them, what is real and what is not? And I feel like that crept so much into our collective just memory bank. And what is really fascinating, and I do feel like we need to touch on how, I want to say fixated, because there are points where I'm not sure we're necessarily horrified by it, but we are fixated on the notion of a creature who can be so human, and then at a given point, they can unleash all of the savagery that I think all of us acknowledge is building up inside of us, especially in the modern world. I mean, we have to look at films that embrace that. Ginger Snaps being one of the best films that carries the psychological aspect of that folklore into the fore, where you have people who are the other, and there is a revelation in the violence that is not smiled upon in any society.
Well, also look at the popularity of true crime and also fictionalized crime, the way that people talk about kind of it's almost a modern folklore about serial killers, how they're perfectly charming and pleasant and everything like that, but then at some point there's something in them that just snaps. That's not always 100% correct, but that's the modern folklore.
I'm not sure I would necessarily call that folklore so much as that is the dark mirror to pre-existing folklore. This is why we had our folklore, is because this is what we are terrified of. And so I almost feel like in the modern day, and again, this was something that changed in the Victorian era, instead of using pseudonyms or false creatures to express our fears, we began confronting them and indulging in them directly, which was where we had like the penny awfuls and all of the like woodcuts of famous serial killers. So while I do think that true crime has a very strong relationship with folklore and the modern imagination, I feel like it's not so much the new folklore as it is the dark mirror to the old folklore. Do you kind of
Oh
see what?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. I definitely get you.
yeah.
It feels very similar, that that same fear is kind of what we're tapping on there.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. And so one of the things I really find interesting, and I feel like we need to discuss, especially moving into our next section, um, with folklore and fear, is I feel like even if we didn't necessarily believe in the creatures of folklore, they were teaching something. Don't go out after dark. Always go to church on Sunday. Do what the Reverend says. Be a good and meek wife. Because you'll notice a lot of these stories demonstrate what happens when you don't do that. So just linger on the werewolf for just a short period of time. Um, Lycaon, in the Greek mythology, he did not offer the correct sacrifice to Zeus, and he was turned into a wolf along with his sons. That's moral teaching. You did wrong. You are no longer part of our society. And then we have, moving up into the Norse era, we have the saga of the Volsungs, which tells the story of the father and the son who found a wolf pelt that had the power to turn them into wolves for 10 days. Well, the story seems to indicate that they ventured so far from humanity that they turned on each other and they ended up nearly killing one another. And moving on, you'll find that as we go on, we will find that in the stories of witches, in the stories of well, let's go ahead and call it the very negative propaganda about the Roma people, who it is a slur, but for the sake of the folklore and for the sake of the horror films that were produced around the folklore, I will say gypsy. But please understand that I do know it is a slur and we are not using it as a catch-all for the Roma and the traveler people. But actually, interesting point. You were talking about real crime. And I brought up how a lot of times real crime is sort of that dark mirror. An interesting point that I feel like we should discuss then is when we use an inflated version, and I think this is actually exactly what you were trying to say, or a version of it. When we use an inflated version of real and horrific crime as that moral teaching tool. Let's look at Shawnee Bean from Scotland. Let's look at Burke and Hare. These figures have become mythical monsters.
They have, and they tie directly back to what kind of our pop culture understanding of these actual crimes is. At some point, these crimes become less about the actual facts and more about the moral and the perception. Don't go out at night, lock all your doors. Don't meet up with somebody. That
Yeah.
there are still lessons that we learn there in the modern world, but we have new monsters.
We've well, let's for starters, let's dabble here real quick before we move on to witch folklore, which I feel like we should also probably touch on vampires really quick. Um but witches is such a ripe ground for us, and I'm gonna just wax poetic on it when we get there. But well, for instance, let's look at Burke and Hare. For anybody, any of our listeners slash watchers who do not know Burke and Hare, they were resurrection men. And what that means is, due to religious constraints, people did not like donating their bodies to science. In the Victorian era, because it was believed if you did not go into the ground whole, you would not achieve the kingdom of heaven. It was a very large superstition. But as our concept of medical knowledge was growing, we needed bodies. Hence came the resurrection men. Resurrection men were men who technically found freshly buried bodies without the consent of that former person's loved ones, took them from the ground and sold them to medical schools. Now, where Burke and Hare differ. Now, resurrection men were already considered socially reprehensible by all but the medical students who were actually getting real life-saving knowledge from these bodies. Where Burke and Hare and other resurrection men differed was they killed people in order to get these very fresh bodies. And finding the truth of Burke and Hare is actually very interesting. It's more difficult than I thought it would be. The first time I looked it up, because so much of them has become steeped in folklore. And it's the same with Shawnee Bean, who is, I do recommend people look him up, famous Scottish cannibal clan.
And I mean, looking at that era, like Jack the Ripper has fascinated people forever. I mean, well, not forever, but since back in the day. Um,
Exactly.
but actually finding the facts of the case and separating those from even rumors and untruths that were told at that time is incredibly difficult.
Don't get me started on Patricia Cromwell. Just don't do it. But yes, that's very true.
I also, to touch on kind of what we were talking about with werewolves, witches, some of these other sort of folklore creatures is there's something similar with some of them, especially the werewolves and witches, is that we see a moral aspect to the monster, but you can become one of them by getting too close to that person. It's like there's a moral contagion there. The werewolf bites you, you become one of them. The witch inducts you into the coven, and you're brought in, and you're just as evil as the rest of them. So you need to stay away from these people.
Exactly. And that's actually something I want to talk about a little bit more when we get to witches, because we will find that um, modern witch films are actually opposing that idea. Hagazusa, which is a brilliant German horror film, actually being one of the first and foremost. But let's whiz very quickly. Actually, I kind of want to brush past vampires for the moment, because I feel like as we get into witches, we need to touch on the subject of gender in folklore, and that ostensibly will lead up into gender in horror. We find that we will find that a lot of horror, especially folklore in horror, is gendered. And for this, I'm going to take us all the way over to Japan. Japan has a lot to say about the mistreatment of women, or women who were wronged. And for this, I want to have us look at a couple of, first, we're going to look at the concept of the onryo. So for anybody who isn't familiar with that, the onryo is for anyone who has seen The Ring, The Grudge, uh, Dark Water, any of the Japanese horror films where you are looking at a white-faced woman with long black hair, who typically died in a very dark and horrible way. This is what we call an onryo. And I feel like this is fascinating to me because in a lot of Western folklore, we are looking at, witches who they are bad because they are the other. They are witches because they are the other. But one of the things I find fascinating about Onryo is yes, they are the other, and yes, they are a monster. But Japanese folklore always blames someone else for their creation. It is not the onus of the woman who has become the Onryo. And I find that a fascinating reversal from a lot of Western folklore.
I'm sorry, I'm like, I was just, and we can probably cut this bit out, but as you were talking about that, I know you have not seen The Terror from AMC,
Mhm.
but the second season is about Japanese American internment, and they touch on that. Um,
Actually, I don't want to cut this because this is part of what I want for this episode is we need to discuss how our fears and how these folklores continue to haunt our imagination and continue to be a part of our media. So this is actually great.
um, yeah, in season two of The Terror, I was a big fan of season one, and I started on season two. Had a character that was very similar to that. It was, she's a woman who is wronged and who is haunting these people. There is a lot of violence that is happening in it's a very recent season of a TV show, but also it contrasts the violence of the monster against the violence of the American government, with the Japanese internment and how Japanese Americans were treated
Mm.
during that time. So we have the mythical monster in that season, but we also have that very real, very human monster that we're seeing in more modern horror, around that time, the turn of the century that we've been talking about with killers and everything.
No, but see, this is remarkable because that's the whole point. Is horror is that looking glass darkly. Horror is we teach through monsters because we can't face our own or we need to face our own. And there is a part of us, a very primal part of us that understands the need to confront the monster, because we are still animals on some level and we feel the need to let it out. It's funny. A lot of the other horror fans that I meet, um, are some of the most harmless, happy people I know in my life because we have a very real outlet. We're just sort of like, we watch these things and we find emotional outlets, or we watch these things and we confront our fears that would eat us and make us angry otherwise. So this is actually why I really wanted to do this episode, because I feel like we do need to confront uh, why folklore is important to our collective consciousness and how it continues to influence our collective consciousness. So actually you bringing that up makes me very, very happy. But kind of going back a little bit, I do find it fascinating that Western folklore and a lot of Western horror movies that rose out of that folklore hold the women responsible for being the other. Whereas, let's look at one of the most famous um, stories of an onryo ever, the Yotsuya Kaidan. Um, the young woman in the Yotsuya Kaidan, which I feel like such a dingus because it's one of my favorite stories, but her name is gone, is driven to madness and death by her husband, who has decided he wants to marry a younger woman. And yes, she comes back as a vengeful ghost. But at that point, I don't think anybody is blaming her. And it's so funny because a lot of Japanese mythology makes it very clear that if you have a female who is a monster, it is very, very frequently not because of anything wrong that she has done, which is such a reversal from Western witch mythology.
Yeah, and even if you look at Eastern folklore, these are women who were wronged mistreated, betrayed. Very similar causes for some of the real world cases of witchcraft in the colonies and things like that. These are women who are oppressed, but the way that they're perceived is completely and totally different.
Mm-hmm. Oiwa. Her name was Oiwa. Haha. Sorry, it was driving me crazy. But yes, that is very true. So let's actually, it looks like we've got about 10 or 20 minutes left. So let's go ahead and move into the lush and terrifying and frankly morally distressing world of witch folklore and how it has informed the films around them and how those films are changing. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about witches historically and the folklore surrounding them. Would you care to kick us off on this one, oh fairy gothfather?
I think it's fascinating how things like the Salem witch trials still capture us and are part of our modern folklore because they're just far enough back that we feel removed from it. We feel like these were definitely, you know, other people. We would not do that sort of thing in our modern enlightened society.
And yet we feel that visceral horror watching it happen because it seems so divorced from us, but at the same time there's that little part of us. There's that little part of us that's very deeply afraid of the emotional extremes.
And I think also it fascinates us so much because we try to find logical reasons for these things. There's every so often you'll see somebody who's like, oh, I absolutely know what happened in Salem. It was, this weird mold and things like that. Because we want to think that there's a rational explanation for these things, but you can't really find a rational explanation for such an extreme emotional thing.
I think what we want a freak answer to we want it to be ergot, but we don't like confronting the fact that it happened for a reason that still exists today. Greed for people's property, um, base misogyny. And I'm not going to say misogyny was all of it because we did lose men in it as well, Giles Corey. But let's be real. There was a huge amount of misogyny because there was a ridiculous amount of pressure on women under the church. And any women who behaved in opposition to what society wanted or what the church wanted, especially if one of their neighbors wanted their land, it was actually ridiculously easy to pass an accusation because these Salem witch trials, they were kangaroo courts. Nobody could prove one way or the other. It was the court of public opinion. And sadly, and the thing that I think frightens us deeply to the core, and that's why we search for things like ergot poisoning, is because those impulses still exist in modern society. That hasn't gone away. And I think that scares us.
They do, and we want this to be, something that's either easily explained or, well, these people were just backwards, they were extremely superstitious, but at that same time, that rough time period, this was right after we had alchemy and things like that were so accepted in the upper echelons of society, but here we have here we have poor farmers that are tearing each other apart to get this tiny scrap of land for themselves to survive off of because it's very hard to live in the colonies. Even over in England, you still had cunning folk, which I think are fascinating to compare the cunning folk to witches and bring that back to how we have our modern folklore. So we have the cunning folk who are extremely skilled in dispelling curses and removing a hex that a witch has placed on somebody, who are essentially using witchcraft, but they're allowed to do it because it's for good reasons. And these days we have, you look at so many things like the the show Hannibal. You have a killer that you have to use to catch another killer. It's very similar in the way that that was set up, but the cunning folk were accepted.
Hmm. Um, one of the things I would like to talk about definitely is definitely the misogyny of not necessarily the Salem witch trials, even though that is a very big and a very public and a very raw scar on especially the American um, memory. I feel like whereas a lot of Japanese mythology understood kind of the pressure and the suffering that women were under in a time when men could just divorce them and say be gone, or could do hideous and horrible things to them, which is why the Onryo myths are so different. I feel like we put a lot of the onus on women in Western witch folklore. So we don't understand a woman's mental illness and she chooses to live alone. Maybe she doesn't come to church on Sunday. Maybe she's illiterate and cannot speak the 10 commandments, or maybe she is what at that time may have been misunderstood because they had no concept of being spectrum and couldn't remember the 10 commandments. This woman was labeled as a witch and the full onus was placed on her. And rather than pulling her into society, we found these women getting pushed out of society and then being punished for not being a part of society, often violently. And it was like it was a zero-sum game for these people. They found themselves othered, sometimes forcibly, by things that were not necessarily their fault. Like, let's be real, the Scarlet Letter, all you need to do is change the soundtrack to a minor key and add in some extra shots, and that's a horror movie. Because what Hester Prynne went through is a lot of the setup for what might otherwise be a witch story.
And
And
I
yes.
think also with these women being forced out, we're not just looking at, people who didn't fit 100% with what everybody wanted to be a part of society, go to church and things like that. In some cases, this was a twofold tragedy because you had people who, this is before the rise of modern medicine, before every town had a doctor, and sometimes you only had the folk healer and the midwife who had a considerable impact on that village or that small town, and they get forced out. And so now you don't have anybody to, who has that knowledge that's been passed down from these generations who have been taking care of the village, who have these herbal remedies that, they're not always 100% as effective as modern medicine, but in some cases, like, you hurt, go chew some willow bark, that does help.
Well, I think the main thing is really like how tragic it was that these women became the other, because there were no stories about ravaging wolfmen. There were no fair little folk in the dark. These were real living people in very recent human memory. And I feel like a lot of witch mythology has evolved in modern horror media. So let's examine a lot of our horror films, like our Argentos, our 70s and 80s sexploitation flicks that starred witches. They were always these sexy temptresses, often lesbians, because why not double up that othering? They were always sexy temptresses and mysterious peddlers of the dark arts who had no real character development. Which, don't get me wrong, those films are fun. And those films, you can still learn a lot about what society felt about people from those films. I will never say that these movies are necessarily bad. you still learn a lot about about what society thought as a whole by what we were putting in our horror movies, even if they were, kind of sexploitational. That still says a lot. But what we're seeing now in recent years is a revolution of the witch. So instead of her being like the sexy temptress who's going to steal your woman and eat your heart, which kind of hot, but if you're into that. But what we're seeing now are films that are kind of examining, they're still horror, but they're examining the horror from another angle. So if we look at one of the early witch movies, I say early, but we're talking 70s, it would be the horror comes from, you have maybe a good man or a good woman, and they're so frightened because there's this mysterious witch who is going to do despicable things to them. And it's blood and dark magic, and the witch is causing the horror. But then, if we look at films like, and I know I've already mentioned it, but it was honestly a jaw-droppingly brilliant film, Hagazusa, I find that a lot of horror movies in the last 10 years are examining the horror from the witch's point of view as the other. And that is a sensation.
Is this where I get to talk about The Craft?
Take it away. Go talk
I,
about the
I
craft.
mean, it's not like a horror movie, but it was exactly that. These are teenagers who are troubled and othered and for various reasons, who have been mistreated, and they turn to this, this dark path to gain this power to actually have some sense of control over their lives. And in the end, it's one of the girls who doesn't take things too far, who, she still has her wits about her and doesn't get sucked in by the rest, who is able to kind of save the day and be sort of how we would see the clever folk back in England. And we saw a lot of that in the 90s with this pop culture kind of like horror light, which was a little bit more digestible and geared towards young adults.
Yep. Now, don't get me wrong. I won't ever say, one of the things that AG and I were very careful to discuss last week was, I don't think there's any one feel for horror. I feel like all horror need do is it needs to express some extreme of human emotion, which touches into our primal fears. Um, and I feel like it needs to work with slightly horrific subject material. And I feel like The Craft does that. I feel like too often people want blood and guts and jump scares out of horror, which is perfectly legit. I will sit down to a good Lucio Fulci film any day. But that's a very specific type of horror. And I feel like since the death of the black and white film, like Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, we've kind of forgotten that really beautiful value of creeping dread that doesn't necessarily ever get resolved. And that's unsettling because it kind of sticks with you afterwards. And that's the horror that lives here. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things. I mean, you mentioned the Magnus Archives. I already mentioned the Terror, and both seasons of that show and all seasons of the Magnus Archives are very much about that creeping dread that doesn't necessarily exist for a reason. These people have not done anything bad. Some of them absolutely have, and it's kind of always fun to have that moment where somebody gets what you think they deserve in a horror film.
Karmic retribution is actually something American films bank on a whole lot, which is why I feel like American horror films are kind of, a lot of people who are more casual horror fans find American horror films easier to watch because there is karmic retribution. You feel good. Everything's tied up at the end. But then when you watch films like Hagazusa or the original cut of The Descent, you don't get that happy ending, and bad things happen for no reason. But again, that's like we said earlier, we fear entropy because
And that
entropy is the one thing you can't fight.
and that's, exactly back to our original folklore. You can take all of these precautions, but a devil might still come and get you in the night, or you might just wind up stepping on the wrong patch of grass. Bad things happen for no reason. And that was very, very prevalent in the folklore. But some, especially like you said, American horror wants to have a reason that bad things happen. And whenever they don't now, because we've expected that formula, it's very unsettling.
It is incredibly unsettling. So okay, let's we are rapidly approaching our hour, which is incredibly sad because we didn't get a chance to really get into the meat of vampires or zombies. So I may actually extend this out into a 2-episode arc because I feel like it is a bit of a travesty not to talk about um Eastern European folklore and fear, and the fear of unwillingly transplanted people, because I feel like we are missing a lot of fertile ground not getting to discuss zombies. So I definitely think I'm going to turn this into a two-parter because
and
it feels wrong to miss that.
and it's a shame to talk about the progression from folklore to horror and not talk about Dracula. I mean,
Oh man, one of the original popular horror novels. Um, God,
that
yes.
took that folklore and just mashed it together into just this amalgamation and put it down on paper. You
And
got
what's so funny about that, and again, we'll get more into this on the next episode. What's so funny about that is that has captured popular imagination so much that a lot of us don't even have any idea what vampire folklore was before Dracula.
and from other cultures, people still try to compare it back, like, oh yeah, this is this country's version of the vampire.
And while I do, and that is actually kind of an important distinction to make, because every culture's version of a vampire or the undead, and I promise you, almost every culture has one, speaks to deep and deep-seated fears in us, like we talked about this episode. So next week, what I would like to cover, we will discuss zombies. We will discuss vampires. I feel really bad that we left out the concept of the Wendigo, because that is more of that moral instruction, and that is from right here in North America, from the people who originally lived here. Um, so, Dee, we will probably have you back next week. We might have AG back as well, so it'll be a 3-person roundtable discussion, which will be fun. Um,
And we could talk a whole lot about death.
oh boy. Um, but honestly, actually, I am very fascinated in that, because different cultures' perception of death is another big thing that plays into horror. And you will notice it also affects our horror media, like our books and our films and our comic books. Um, So that I am going to call a wrap for the first installment of Folklore and Fear. My name is Milo, and this.
I'm Dorian. Still, I made it to the end of this episode without becoming somebody different, so I think we're doing good.
I don't know, man. I don't know, man. There were moments where your camera went out. Oh no.
You were not meant to see what happened whenever the camera went out. That was for your own protection.
Well, that's going to haunt me until next week. And to everybody out there, I hope that we haunt you until next time. So that's a big good night from us to all of our gore hounds and scream queens. Good night, and we'll see you next week.